Or if you think about a traditional classroom where the teacher holds the authority and all the knowledge and sort of distributes it to the children, and the children, consume it. It has students sitting around an oval table, and it's the idea that you are co-constructing your learning in real time.
I do want to understand more about the different school structures, because I, as just like someone who went to public school, don't understand like the public school, charter school, private school, boarding school. Am I missing another type of school?
Homeschool.
Homeschool.
Yeah.
Like, can you guys like provide the framework for that?
I don't know if
I could try.
Yeah.
I can start. Maybe you could fill in.
Sure.
That's her game plan.
Yeah.
My understanding is that the vast majority, I think it's like actually, 98% of kids in America go to some form of public school. Maybe there's some homeschool in there too, but I'm pretty sure only 2% of the entire nation goes to a private school, which would include parochial Catholic schools.
What's parochial?
Sort of like religious, right? Yeah, like religious schools. And then we're I would say an independent, non-parochial school. So I think we have some religious roots, possibly.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. But in the independent school world, we both have dabbled in boarding school, which is its own little beast, I think, right? So
where, like, what's the origin of these types of schools? Like, why are there different branches like that? And also, 98%, like the 2% is a lot smaller than I thought it would be.
Yeah. I'm not sure the percentages. It might be a little larger.
I know it's pretty small, but I do know that relatively in terms of like college representation, like Ivy League schools have an overrepresentation of private school students. So don't quote me, but like I would say if it's 2%, maybe more, like you said, then it's like 5-fold, 10-fold larger of a representation in Ivy League schools. So that probably explains why we exist.
Like a funnel to go to these Ivy League schools, or do you mean more about funding?
Just like a way in which I think families feel like they have an edge for their children to make it to top tier universities in the U.S. They feel like independent schools are a path that they can afford, or they can have financial aid or secure somehow. But it gives their kids a little bit of an edge to get into like college or the colleges that they want to go to.
Right. Which kind of goes like hand in hand with these larger universities. They're they have a notoriety because of the funding that they have, and so also if only 2% of the population is going to a private school, it's because they come from, I guess, money and can afford it to an extent.
I mean, I think it's issues of access. So a lot of times with independent schools, you'll hear language about like college preparatory schools, right? So like in the public high school I went to, we took a couple of different paths. Like some of us went to college, and usually a state school. Like I went to a state school, I went to Rutgers. Some went to vocational school, and some went to community college. So there are different paths. I think in a lot of the independent schools that we tend to focus on, they are meant for college preparatory. So usually students will attend a 4-year. The expectation, I think, is that you'll attend a 4-year college, depending on selectivity. But
I see.
I think sometimes it is the expectation that like there's a particular tier in which you would try to attend.
So why did you guys choose to teach at a private school? Is that too much too soon?
No, I'm just gonna say you first.
Why? Well, I mean, part of it is logistical. I don't have my certification to teach at a public school. So that's one of the reasons. But also, I think, like, now that I've been teaching for a while, I probably could go back and get some of that certification. But I do very much like in an independent school that we're not, we have a little bit more autonomy to teach the way in which we want to teach in terms of making sure that we're connecting with the kids. Our class sizes are a little bit smaller. We have a little bit more autonomy in terms as a system, in terms of our curriculum.
Yeah. So did you not pursue credentials beforehand, knowing this is the route you wanted to go?
No. I don't know, did you?
Yeah, so my story's a little bit different. I don't think you necessarily wanted to be a teacher like when you were in grad school, right?
No, I thought, I mean, I'd gotten my master's and I thought I would probably go on to get my PhD, but then that, just for life circumstances, ended up taking a break. And so when I went out to look for a teaching job, but the only experience I had was in tutoring and teaching in grad school, I was able to land a job at a boarding school. And at the independent schools and the boarding schools, they didn't need certification. They were looking for just a specialty, like a master's in English.
I see.
So I was able to move into that world and just since then have been really fortunate to be mentored by really strong, supportive teachers who've helped me learn how to teach. But had I not had them, I'm not sure where I would have gotten that background from.
Right.
But your experience is different.
Yeah, so I was living in New York City, working as a paralegal in a law firm, and yeah,
Totally different.
yeah. So I just kind of had this like heart change where I didn't know if I wanted to just live that corporate litigation life like that. I was seeing these junior associates or whatever, living it up.
What about that was like rubbing against like who you are as a person?
I think it was twofold. I think one is my regular hours were from 10 to 8. So we always ate dinner in the law firm. And then typically you'd either go home, get car service, go home, or you'd go out and you'd go out with coworkers a lot of times or other people you knew in the city, but a lot of times with coworkers. And it just was this like cyclical, like you'd go out to lounges, bars, and spend money, and I didn't envision my life being like that. I think at one point, it's kind of crazy. So we were, as paralegals, we were just sitting around talking, and this one paralegal, we were talking about like the Facebook, like a physical Facebook so you could see all the attorneys on there. And we were bored because all we were doing is like photocopying or checking things. Like paralegals do nothing. Nothing of substance, I feel like. But anyways, we were kind of going around talking about all the lawyers, and we realized that only 50% were married, right? Of all the lawyers that we were there, and half of those were on their second marriages. So I was like, I think at that point I was like,
Is that my future?
yeah.
I
Yeah, I was like, is this really what is going to make me happy? And I kind of like impromptu called my parents in Korea and was like, I don't think I'm going to go to law school.
How was that to tell them that?
Yeah, they were mad. I went to a private school for college, and they spent a lot of money, and they weren't super happy. But I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do at the time. I was good at I had just taken the LSATs. Prior to that, I had taken the MCATs. And then I had also taken the GRE. So, like, I'd taken a lot of tests.
Asian child.
Test taking machine here.
Yeah. So I was like, I could teach. Well, I was like, I could get a job at Princeton Review. Like, that's what I was thinking. Yeah. Like if I didn't want to be a lawyer, I could, at least for now, I could teach people how to take tests.
Yeah.
And then I
That's
think,
kind of what you're doing now.
yeah, it's still what I'm doing.
Plug your company.
Prepinnovation.com. So so I, and then that's how I caught the bug. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed the kind of relationships that you would have with students, and I thought I could probably do this like for real, right? And so I did my alternate route and became a public school teacher in New Jersey. And then I transitioned into a boarding school. So.
What's the environment like in a boarding school?
It's a very long conversation. I think it depends on the boarding school, so I can only speak on the two that I've taught at. And I'm at a day school now, but I really did love a boarding school atmosphere.
I recently learned day school is like there's boarding school where kids are sleeping there, but then there's students who don't sleep there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but at both of the boarding schools that I was at, it's just a really unique community where, as educators, I think you want to try to be as helpful and supportive as you can with the kids, and also with other colleagues where you feel like you're in a constant state of growing and learning, and you get that at a boarding school. And I think even when you think about schools in general, it's hard in life to find like K through 12 or even 9 through 12, where you have this time period, a protracted time period where you can really work with a group of kids and shape their thinking. And so when you think about a boarding school, you are living, like I lived in a dorm, so I've lived with sophomore and junior girls, and I was the assistant housemaster, and I taught the kids, and I coached them. I don't know what kind of coaching I did in terms of really helping them. We had meals with them. We were in chapel with them together. And so sometimes, when you think about the interactions you have with a student in the classroom, that's sort of like one facet of it, or one facet of them and their learning. But when you're with them all the time, it's really special, because not only do you get to see a whole child, but they also see more of who you are. So they see you with your children or with your spouse, and trying to carry groceries into the house, and so it's a stronger community in that sense. In day schools, I think, depending on actually at our school, we have a lot of teachers that were boarding school teachers that are now at the day school, and we've brought that same spirit in there. So you can see it replicated in different ways. It's just a little different, though, because when we go home, we have that separation, whereas when you're at a boarding school, it wouldn't be uncommon.
Blurred.
Yeah, like, if during study hall or when you're on duty, I mean, you can theoretically be with kids from 7 in the morning all the way till past midnight, depending on if they need to talk or just work through things. And so, yeah, it's a really special experience.
Yeah, you almost become like their primary caretaker. Like, I'm sure more influential than their parents in some regard, because of the amount of time you're spending with them.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had, a handful of conversation with different friends who are teachers, and it's because it's just a topic that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess like everything else in the world, it's all about funding, and like I had one friend who taught at a public school and in a low income area, and she was just like, the challenge with that is that like the kids are coming with different struggles, and like maybe they didn't sleep well, they didn't eat well, and forget about even thinking about learning. Like, this kid physically is just not well. And then I nannied for a stint, and the girl, she went to a phenomenal private school, and I'm just like, man, I wish all the kids could have this, But it's almost like boarding school could, I guess, just hearing you talk, I almost think like, oh, that's such a great option for children in general. Like, because if the home, depending on the home environment, if that support isn't there, being at a boarding school could really be life-changing for a kid.
Yeah, in some ways I feel like it's more equitable than a day school or other schools, just because of the access you have to phenomenal teachers. Because, why would you pay $200 an hour for a tutor if like you could just show up at their dorm and say, Miss Lee, can you help me with my essay? You know, like
Yeah.
it's almost like it evens it out a little bit more. I mean, that doesn't mean that at boarding school there aren't really significant disparities and equity issues, but in some ways I think it does level the playing field a little bit. And
Everyone's sleeping and eating the same way 'cause
Yep.
at the school.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't. As I get older and I get to work with different kids, like in other schools, and in like there's a great program called Homeworks, which we could talk about later. But even just my son's not at my school or Lawrenceville. He's at another school. He's at a Quaker school. And there are just a lot of different types of schools. So sometimes I get nervous when there's sort of the rankings because. I don't know, when you think about the role of education, sometimes I feel like there are different goals and aims, and I know the rankings are important, especially given what we talked about, just when parents invest in an experience. But I do sometimes worry about the rankings because I know a lot of really bright kids that have gotten rejected from some of these schools or have found different paths, or like I know for my son, as great as the boarding school experience is, he attends a boarding school, but he's a day student there. And
What was the reason behind that decision?
I'm a selfish parent and want to keep him home with me because I know that, in a couple years he will be leaving to go to college, and so I want to be able to spend as much time as I can with him.
Which raises an interesting, point about boarding school, because, I guess, the parents don't get to see their kids that much. I mean, do you guys know the impact that has on children as well? Because there's just a good side of it, which is, everything we just talked about, and there is that.
well, I was gonna say, I was like, I mean, is selfishness is sometimes perspective. I'm not really sure. I would say, so I would make the case that maybe being selfish is sending your kids to boarding school, because you don't want to do all the things that maybe you should be doing as a parent, and that you want your kids to have this amazing opportunity. No, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's tough, this whole who gets into what schools and because the boarding school admissions process in a lot of ways mimics the college admissions process, but at a much earlier age when kids are still forming their senses of who they are, and so you ask yourself, does that really, when you winnow the black and the white sheep, metaphorically, when they're 12 years old, you wonder whether or not that's fair or right. So it's complicated, I think, ethically and morally. But I would say, if just from a college perspective, I will say, if you go to Lawrenceville, if you go to Exeter, you go to Choate, you're going to have an advantage for certain opportunities at the next level. And so I don't think whether that's fair or right is a different question than the reality of that being the case. And I think that pragmatic aspect of it is what drives people to I taught at Petty, and my last year there was $65,000 to have tuition and room and board, which is a lot.
Yeah, I mean, which also that's a very small population of people who have that kind of access, or can send their kids to school like that. I wish you guys had to listen to the Malcolm Gladwell podcast, because I mean, this is literally what he talks about, and because he talks about U.S. News and Report, who does the college rankings, and have you guys read any of Malcolm Gladwell? He kind of tries to find what's really going on, kind of digs into it, and what he found is that this algorithm that they use to actually rank these schools are in some ways arbitrary and subjective, and also he just thinks the fact he's not watching this, but like, not to totally maybe misquote him, but I think like even that, why are we ranking schools, you know? And he's just saying for how big this country is, like, how do we say only like 10 schools are like the best schools? And I think kind of to what you guys are saying is like, he's also kind of, I guess, like in saying that education should, like schools should really be about like fit, like cultural fit, learning and things of that nature, opposed to just like, you know, someone having a status. Because the way like affirmative action works, like someone, and the example he gave was like, you know, this one girl got into Wesleyan, and they're like, oh, well, you just got in because you're black or something. And then he's like, but no one ever says, well, you got in because your dad's rich, or like because your parents went to this school, which is kind of it's the same side of the coin kind of a thing. But you guys have to listen to it. It's really interesting. Yeah. But so Lawrenceville. So you didn't answer it. Why is it such a good school? Like, how do they rank it? Or not to go back to ranking again, but like, why does it have its notoriety, I guess?
All the schools actually in our area are really wonderful. Lawrenceville has a long history. It was established in 1810. And so, I mean, I don't know the full history, but one of the things that it adopted early on that came from Exeter was like a Harkness learning style, or Harkness pedagogy.
What is that?
Well, it's sort of like decenters the sage on the stage. So where if you think about a traditional classroom where the teacher holds the authority and all the knowledge and sort of distributes it to the children, and the children, you know, consume it, it has students sitting around an oval table. And it's the idea that, you know, you are co-constructing your learning in real time. So the instructor is the 13th chair, so traditionally 12 kids around the table. Early on, 12 boys around the table. And then it went co-ed in the 80s. But it is the idea that the onus of learning is on the student. And so there's all this co-constructing that has to come with learning and being able to critically think and take in all these different opinions, but that each person around the table, it's sort of this democratic process where each person around the table has something important to say and to contribute. And you can never sort of opt out of the learning. You're always in it. And it's a spirit that gets brought from the classroom to the dorm, to teams, to it's like this mindset and the way you live your life.
Is there like a example of that, like to illustrate that type of learning?
I mean, it happens in a lot of different schools. It's at PDS. Like I said, it started in Exeter. It probably is at Petty, right, to some extent.
Yeah, it's influenced most independent schools, I would say, have adopted it in some form. If maybe not in all departments, like science, but certainly in English and in history, it's a common practice, I think, in independent schools.
But it is really empowering for students to, like, for example, in an English class, and this happens with my students now, we're not quite in a circle, but we're like in a rectangle, but we'll be discussing a text. And what we do is sort of in the training of thinking critically, it's the idea of like, how might a person who studies literature think about this text, right? Because a scientist might think about it differently or have a particular like mental model or like a schema. So we're teaching them how to think about it, but also giving them buy-in to, like, if we're reading this text, to say, okay, let's think of our modes of interpretation. Like, what are the questions that you might ask? And what are ways, like, at every time there's an interpretation, what are ways where you might go, do I agree with that? Do I disagree with that? Do I want to modify that? What evidence do I have? But then to be in conversation. And so the idea is that, like, if you're in a true discussion, you're working towards a synthesis or a sense of truth, right? So it's not a debate where it's like, you're wrong, my interpretation's right, but it's this open-mindedness of really looking at the text and saying, let me stop to consider what Jason might be thinking, and how might I use some of his thinking to be in conversation with mine so that we can work together to try to understand a truth by the end of the reading of the text, or some way of seeing things that, like a metaphor that you might see is, you know, the elephant with the 5 blind men. My friend Pierre Koistra uses that a lot too, where it's like everybody has a different piece of it, right? But until you can see the wholeness of it, by relying on others, you won't get the full beauty of the piece or the full complexity of something. So, I mean, that it happens like, so to your question, it can happen in just discussing a poem or a text, or even an issue, right? If we were to talk about like, what does it mean to be selfish, right? So you have now 13 people around the table, some from Asia, some from Africa, right? Some down the street saying, well, in my family, this is what it means. Here's my story about it. And then you have another person, and then we start to weave them together. And it's like each time somebody can ask a question or, you know, just raise a thought, like suddenly the whole conversation, it's like really dynamic. It can constantly shift.
But so if everyone had to reach some sort of like absolute truth, I guess, like where's the room for maybe like, is there absolute truth in everything?
Yeah, I mean, at least in like our English classrooms, it is the idea too of, you know, we might leave the class saying, I have more questions than I have answers. And for me, as an educator, I'm like, that's a good place to be. I think there's an intellectual humility that can come from like really understanding that there's so much to learn. Like if you leave going, I got this, I'd be worried, right? Because it's just things are super complicated, and like a text that you can read as a 9th grader and then revisit as a 12th grader and then revisit when you're in your 40s, your life experience grows with it. So that I think it's the sense of like, but every time we're rereading something, it's like we're revising. And so I don't know in the sense of truth, but it is the sense of like, if you are really being open to other ideas and ways of seeing, there's a complexity and a critical thinking that can come from learning, which is quite beautiful.
And I think the beauty of it to me is that it denies the sense of an abstract absolute truth. So there's this idea that like truth emerges through community, through conversation. Like I contribute my verse to the poetry of the truth, right? Like no one has like complete ownership of the truth, and that's not always true, especially when you get into higher level academics, because somebody you might like those law movies, right? Where like you're like the first year law students like, well, I think, and like, what do you know? Right? It's like, this is what the law is, and this is what you need to understand about the law. And it's very like patronizing in some ways, but it's very top down.
Yeah.
And this approach to learning is so much more like, let's all together, right, make meaning of the text.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
How do you guys nurture students engaging in this learning process for introverts and extroverts? Because I'm sure there's different challenges with the two types of personalities.
Yeah, and I think in different disciplines too.
For sure.
I mean, I think like I said before, we don't have to keep focusing on like hardness learning, but it might just be more broadly like teaching and learning. But I think it's starting off with principles, right? And this idea that like there will be kids who will be more outspoken or more introverted, but there are different ways where you can create that learning environment. So maybe for the kid who is like, I'm not quite comfortable speaking in front of 13 kids, I already feel like, I don't know, I must be an admissions error, which is how I felt a lot of the times where I'm like, I don't know what to say. But if you pair and share, right, I'm much more comfortable talking to Jason or one person or small groups. And a lot of times there are these different strategies where you can get them to talk in small groups and maybe even get around to practice, right? And then once they sort of gotten confirmation to feel like they've practiced it, then they're comfortable sharing out. And then there are other things too where it's like, jigsaw, where everybody's responsible for a certain piece, so you're reliant on others. But I think a lot of it is like a practice-driven mindset where, you have the term or the year to really practice, and it's not just about like classroom participation. A lot of times, at least for me, I tied into the relevance of being able to have a voice and how that's empowering. So maybe it's not speaking in front of the class, but maybe it's articulating your voice so you can have clarity of thinking in your writing, right? Or or testing out your ideas so you can get feedback in real time, right? So we tie it into different modes of like practice, but also saying, look, you know, as a female or maybe as, you know, whatever group, maybe someday you are going to have to advocate for somebody who's really going to need your help, or you will have to advocate for yourself or negotiate a contract. You don't want that to be the first time you're learning how to speak for yourself. So think of this as practice, where every day you're coming in and getting a little practice in terms of activating your voice, but holding presence in a space. And some of that's tied in like to what we were saying before, the psychology of belonging and self-efficacy as a student, where I think traditional models have it that like there's this deficit, right? And we're like filling it as these wise people. But really that's a bizarre model, right? And if you go on the premise that like every kid has this innate excellence and brilliance that sort of needs to be brought out with proper you know, with tools and education and ways of like actualizing themselves, it's like a shift where you think like, if we have Jason here, how do I help him begin to actualize all this power that he has? How might English, like for my discipline, how might stories help him begin to activate that, so that when he's, you know, finished with my class and outside of school, he feels as if he can move through this world with a sense of agency.
Yeah. That is just like beautiful to think that this exists. Because I come from public school.
Me
Just,
too.
you know, I never, even as an adult, like you're not exposed to stuff like that. So just to hear this seems like a dream.
Well,
I mean, I'm sure it's not all rainbows and butterflies, but at least the intent and that type of environment.
I would say, yeah, it is beautiful, and it's not always possible in public schools. So here's like one, because I wonder, right? Because there are excellent teachers in public schools, but like I think one parameter that can be a detracting factor from the quality of education is simply size of classrooms. Like I think, like when I was a public school teacher, like when there were 21 kids, I was like, okay, I can do this. And then 25 is like, whoa. And then like 28, you're like, I can't do this, right? It was so overwhelming. I had typically 5 sections on average 25 kids when I was a public school educator. When you think about that's 125 kids. And now the average teacher at an independent school has 4 sections of around 15. So you do the math, that's 60 kids. So how much more can you create an environment, you know, for 15 kids, 13 kids around a table, than rows and columns of like 27 kids. It's a very different experience in my opinion. And so it's not always like, oh, those public school teachers. It's not that at all. I feel like in a lot of ways, public school teachers are more informed and well-trained in teaching and learning than a lot of independent school teachers at least start off to be. It's just they don't get to execute the things as well because they're restricted with certain parameters, and class size is one of them.
How does this learning style and approach, you know, to kind of like what you were saying, which is actualizing the student's potential and skills, like how does that kind of coincide with the goal of the school, which before you guys said was the track to, you know, attend a top tier school?
I don't know if I would say, I just qualify that a little bit. I don't know if I would say we as schools believe that's our purpose.
Okay.
I would just say a lot of parents see independent schools as having that primary impact for their families.
How are those two things different?
Because I think as educators, if you actually talk to us who are in the thick of things, I would say the vast majority of us, all we really want to do is maximize the potential we see in our students, right? We want them to be the best versions of themselves in whatever field, whatever discipline that they can be. And we truly, like that's why for all educators, but including private school educators, like that's why Carol Dweck's like growth mindset really resonated with teachers is because like we ultimately it's that's why I teach, right? Because I believe that. I believe that they are not set in their ways. Their intelligence is fixed.
Right.
I believe that they have the potential to be this beautiful, amazing, powerful person with an amazing voice and
My
impact.
first blog post was on that book.
Yeah, that's a great
My
book.
shameless plug.
That's a great podcast to start off with, I think. And then, but yeah, I mean, I think we see our purpose as that, and we recognize that not all the kids, that the kids coming into our space are privileged. It would be not truthful to say that people coming into an independent school aren't privileged. They are, for sure. That doesn't mean that those kids don't have needs, and that they can't be good people and be meaningfully contribute to society. And you were asking like why we went to, because I get that, because like I told people when I first went into teaching, like I want to help people. Like I went to this like sort of like blue collar town with a lot of diversity, and eventually I ended up at this like boarding school that cost like $50,000 a year. And
You sold out. That's
yeah, I know. And so people are like, whoa, like you sold out, Jason. Yeah.